Welcome to a journey into one of the darkest and most brutal chapters of Asian history. The popular narrative of Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, often casts her as a brilliant and pioneering ruler. But this sanitized story is not the one we're here to tell. In this video, we're going to strip away the myth and expose the chilling reality of her rise to power, a meticulously orchestrated campaign of cruelty and terror that makes her one of Asia's most notorious rulers. Based on careful research into the official records and historical chronicles, we will explore the unflinching truth of how a woman clawed her way to the dragon throne, leaving a trail of betrayal and murder in her wake. Stay with us as we uncover the secrets of her blood-soaked ascent and the horrifying legacy she left behind. The air in the imperial court of Chang'an was not a place of serenity, but a world of suffocating ambition and hidden daggers. Its history, as written by the men who ruled it, tells a tale of a brilliant dynasty, a golden age of art and poetry. But behind the silk curtains and the scent of jasmine lay a more sinister truth, a relentless struggle for power where a woman's life was a fragile thing and her future was a gift from men. The popular imagination of Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, often casts her as a pioneering feminist, a powerful ruler who ascended to the highest office through sheer will and intelligence. But this romanticized view, like a thin layer of gold leaf, hides a far more chilling reality. What transpired in her rise was not merely a political ascent, but a meticulously orchestrated campaign of cruelty, a theater of betrayal and murder designed to shatter a man's world and rebuild it in her own image. This was a power play so horrific, so public, and so thoroughly documented that it would serve as a warning to anyone who dared challenge her authority. The method chosen was not a weapon, but the strategic use of cunning, accusation, and absolute terror. This wasn't simply about gaining a life. It was about the systematic destruction of her rivals, the obliteration of hope for a traditional court, and the creation of a spectacle so terrifying that it would haunt the collective memory of the dynasty for centuries to come. To understand the full horror of Wu Zetian's ascent, we must first grasp the world that created her. The Tang dynasty in the late 7th century was a land caught between tradition and the ambition of a single woman. Wu Zetian emerged from this chaos not as a noblewoman seeking power, but as a minor concubine driven by a profound, if unspoken, sense of personal injustice. The court she entered was a place where lineage and male dominance were the bedrock of power. For a woman, power was a fragile, borrowed thing, handed down from a father or a husband. Wu Zetian, however, would not borrow her power. She would take it. The historical records of the Tang dynasty tell of a young woman named Wu Zhao entering the imperial court during the reign of Emperor Taizong. At the time, she was a kerain, a concubine of a mid-level rank, one of many women whose lives were tethered to the will of the emperor. The court of Chang'an was a complex hierarchical system of power, its glittering surface concealing a constant, subtle struggle for influence and survival. Wu Zhao, even at a young age, navigated this world with a cold and calculating precision that distinguished her from her peers. She was a keen observer, learning not just the rituals of the court, but the vulnerabilities of those who moved within it. She carried herself with an unnerving stillness, her sharp gaze missing nothing, her movements deliberate and graceful. A famous anecdote, later recorded in the historical chronicles, provides a crucial insight into her character. Emperor Taizong possessed a wild horse, a magnificent stallion that was untamable. After all the men of the court failed to subdue the animal, the young Wu Zhao, watching from the periphery, offered a stark solution. She said she would need 3 things: an iron whip, an iron hammer, and a dagger. The whip would make the horse submit, the hammer would break its spirit if it resisted, and the dagger, she stated plainly, would be used to kill it if it refused to be broken. The emperor, a man who valued strength and dominance, was said to have been impressed by her ruthless pragmatism. This account, whether fully factual or embellished, serves as an early indication of the profound and unsentimental will that would come to define her. She saw the world not as a place for negotiation, but for absolute control. Following the death of Emperor Taizong, the established protocol dictated the fate of many of his concubines. Wu Jiao was one of the women sent to Ganye Temple, a Buddhist nunnery where they would live out their lives in obscurity. It was a complete and utter removal from the world of power she had briefly inhabited. For a woman of her ambition, this was not just an exile, it was a form of political and personal death. She spent several years in this austere environment, stripped of her titles, her luxurious clothing, and her future. The soft whispers of the palace were replaced by the chanting of scriptures. The scents of perfume and rich food were gone, replaced by the smell of incense and stale rice. This was a profound act of erasure, a stripping away of all she had ever been. She was no longer a concubine, no longer even Wu Zhao. She was a woman in waiting, a forgotten piece of a past reign. For most, this would have been the end of their story. But for Wu Zhao, it was a period of intense reflection and cultivation of patience. Beneath the facade of a pious nun, the fires of her ambition were not extinguished. They smoldered, fueled by the humiliation of her exile. She had learned the hard lessons of court life, but in the solitude of the temple, she began to understand a deeper truth. To survive, one must not play by the rules, but create them. The memory of the palace, of the power she had briefly tasted, became an obsession. She clung to it, nurtured it, and waited. Her second chance came not from political maneuvering, but from the emotional ties of the new emperor, Gaozong, who had been a prince during her time at court. Historical accounts suggest that he had been taken with her during his father's reign and had never forgotten her. Upon her return, she was not just a former concubine. She was a woman whose past had taught her a profound lesson in survival. She entered the court no longer as an innocent girl, but as a determined strategist. Her re-entry marked a crucial turning point, not just in her life, but in the political landscape of the entire Tang dynasty. The stage was now set for the next chapter of her story, a story that would be written not with silk and ink, but with cunning, deceit, and ultimately, blood. The great game of the court was about to be reshaped by a woman who had nothing left to lose. The return of Wu Zhao to the court was not a triumph, but an act of strategic subtlety. She did not arrive with fanfare, but as a ghost from the past, a memory that Emperor Gaozong had never truly been able to shake. Her presence was a calming balm to the young, indecisive ruler, a stark contrast to the stiff formality of Empress Wang and the overtly demanding nature of Consort Xiao. Wu Zetian, now more mature and possessing a quiet confidence forged in the solitude of Ganye Temple, was a master of observation. She learned the emperor's weaknesses, his desire for peace, and his need for a strong, decisive partner. While others of the court vied for his attention with lavish gifts and theatrical displays, she offered something more insidious: companionship, understanding, and the promise of a sharp intellect to guide him. She did not seek to rule him, but to be a part of his mind. This unexpected favoritism did not go unnoticed. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, two women who had been rivals for the emperor's affection, now found themselves in a forced and frantic alliance against this new threat. They saw Wu Zetian as a lowly upstart, a concubine returned from a nunnery who had no right to challenge their established authority. Their attacks were those of the old order: gossip, political maneuvering, and attempts to turn the emperor's family against her. They accused her of witchcraft and sorcery, clinging to the familiar tools of courtly intrigue that had always worked before. but they failed to understand that Zetian was not playing the same game. They were playing with daggers, while she was playing with poison. The turning point, a moment of profound and chilling horror that has haunted historians for centuries, came with the birth of Zetian's daughter. A healthy, beautiful girl whose arrival was a source of great joy for the emperor. But within days, the child was found dead in her crib. The immediate cause of death was unclear, but Zetian, a woman of perfect composure, was said to have reacted with an almost preternatural calm. She was the one who found the child, and she was the one who, with an expression of heartbreaking grief, immediately accused Empress Wang. There was no direct evidence, no witnesses who could definitively attest to her claims, but Zetian's accusation, delivered with devastating conviction, was a political masterstroke. The historical chronicles of the time offer little beyond the official account, leaving the true nature of the child's death a subject of debate. Was it a tragic accident, a case of natural crib death? Or was it, as many later historians would conclude, the ultimate act of calculated cruelty, the murder of her own daughter, to create the perfect political weapon? The answer remains hidden in the mists of history, but the impact of the accusation was immediate and absolute. The emperor, consumed by his grief and a growing cold suspicion, turned against Empress Wang. Her denials were seen as lies, her pleas for innocence as the desperate words of a guilty woman. The trust between them, a foundation of her power, was irrevocably shattered. With the emperor's trust secured and his mind poisoned, Zetian's next move was swift and decisive. In the autumn of 655, she leveled charges of witchcraft against both Empress Wang and Consort Xiao. The evidence was flimsy, a concoction of rumor and fabrication, but it was enough. The court, once a bastion of tradition and law, was paralyzed by fear. The emperor, torn between his duty and his love, hesitated. He was heard to have said that he could not bear to part with them, but Zetian was unyielding. Her demands for their removal were not requests, but commands. A palace coup was averted only by the sheer force of her will. On Zetian's personal orders, both Empress Wang and Consort Xiao were deposed and executed. The brutality of their deaths, they were flogged 100 times, then had their hands and feet severed before being placed in wine vats to die, was a message of terrifying clarity. This was not just the removal of political rivals. It was a statement. Zetian was not a woman who played by the rules of the court. She was a woman who would shatter the old order with a vengeance, using every weapon at her disposal, including murder and infamy. With her two most powerful rivals brutally removed, the path was clear. In the same year, Emperor Gaozong elevated her to the position of empress. She had seized the most powerful title a woman could hold, not through lineage or political favor, but with a horrifying, blood-soaked cunning that would become the hallmark of her reign. The serpent, having successfully poisoned the nest, now occupied the throne. The moment Zetian was elevated to empress, she did not rest. She had secured the highest title a woman could hold, but she was acutely aware that her position was precarious, a fortress built on the shifting sands of political favor. The court was filled with powerful men, venerable elder statesmen, loyal to the Li clan and the traditions of the Tang dynasty. They had tolerated her as a concubine and watched her rise with growing apprehension. They were not just political opponents. They were the living embodiment of the old order, and to secure her power, she would have to systematically dismantle them one by one. Her campaign began with a quiet, calculated brutality. The targets were not chosen at random, but were the most vocal and respected officials who had opposed her elevation. Men like Zhangsun Wuji, the powerful and influential uncle of Emperor Gaozong, and Chu Suiliang, a revered chancellor, were accused of treason by Zetian's new faction. The accusations were flimsy, a concoction of rumor and fabrication, but they were wielded with the full weight of the Empress's newfound power. The narrative was simple. These men were not loyal to the emperor, but to themselves and their old ways, a threat to the stability of the dynasty. Jiang Sun Wuji, a man who had been a pillar of the court, was exiled and eventually forced to commit suicide. Chu Suiliang's sons were executed, his family disgraced. The message was unmistakable. No one, regardless of their rank or service to the empire, was safe. This systematic purge was not just about removing rivals. It was about creating a new political landscape. Wu Zetian placed her loyal allies in positions of power, men like Xu Jingzong and Li Yifu, who owed their entire careers to her patronage. These men were her eyes and ears, and they created a climate of fear and suspicion that permeated the court. She understood that loyalty, in the absence of fear, was a fleeting thing. To ensure her control, she needed to create a system of terror that would silence all dissent, both spoken and unspoken. This is where the infamous secret police came into being. She set up copper mailboxes around the court, a seemingly innocuous innovation. But these were not for petitions or pleasantries. They were for anonymous denunciations, a tool for her agents to gather information and sow distrust. Agents like Suo Yuanli, Zhou Xing, and Lai Junqian were given immense power, operating outside the traditional legal system. They had the authority to arrest anyone, torture them for confessions, and secure their convictions without due process. The very fear of being denounced was enough to turn officials against each other, to make them self-police their thoughts and words. It was a brilliant, horrifying system of control, formalized in manuals like the Manual of Accusation, which codified the methods of torture and false testimony. The brutality did not stop with her political opponents. The historical record, though often ambiguous, suggests a far more personal and chilling cruelty. Wu Zetian, the mother of two sons who were crown princes, saw them not as beloved children, but as potential rivals. Crown Prince Li Hong began to express his dissatisfaction with her ever-expanding power, a fatal mistake. In 675, he died suddenly. While no autopsy was ever performed, later historians consistently ascribed his death to poisoning by his mother. Shortly after, her other son, Li Xian, who had begun to show a similar streak of independence, was also accused of treason and forced to commit suicide. In a world where a mother would willingly kill her own children for power, no one was truly safe. The traditional bonds of family, loyalty, and law were all being sacrificed on the altar of her ambition. By the end of this period, Emperor Gaozong was a man in name only, a frail and ailing figure whose power had been almost completely subsumed by his empress. She now ruled as a de facto regent, controlling all official edicts and decisions. The court that had once been a bastion of tradition was now a den of spies and sycophants. All who had dared to oppose her were either dead, exiled, or reduced to trembling silence. The crown she wore, once a symbol of beauty and status, was now a crown of thorns, a symbol of the immense paranoia and isolation that came with her absolute power. The stage was set for the final, audacious act, the complete usurpation of the throne itself. With the passing of Emperor Gaozong, the last vestige of the old order's control vanished. Wu Zetian, now Empress Dowager and Regent, held a power that was unprecedented for a woman in Chinese history. She was no longer a consort or a queen. She was the singular, undeniable force behind the throne, but she was not yet satisfied. She understood that a regent's power was borrowed, a temporary state that could be revoked at any moment. To truly secure her place in history, she needed to take the throne itself, to sit as emperor in her own right. Her first act was to install her son, Li Zhe, as Emperor Zhongzong, But he was not to be a true ruler, merely a puppet whose strings she would pull from the shadows. However, the plan unraveled almost immediately. Zhongzong, despite his mother's complete control, began to show a streak of independence, making his father-in-law a chancellor and attempting to assert his authority. This was a fatal mistake. Zetian had not spent a lifetime clawing her way to the top to be undermined by a son who had no understanding of the blood it took to get there. Her response was swift and absolute. Within 2 months of his enthronement, she had him deposed. In his place, she installed her more compliant and younger son, Li Dan, as Emperor Ruizong. Zhongzong's father-in-law was exiled, and the entire family was disgraced. The message was clear. She was not merely a regent, she was the emperor, maker, and she would not tolerate even the slightest resistance. The years that followed were defined by a new level of terror. The secret police, under the leadership of men like Lai Junqian, became an instrument of pure state terror. Anonymous mailboxes were no longer just a tool for gathering information. They were a death sentence. To be accused was to be guilty. Torture manuals were used to extract confessions, and the slightest whisper of disloyalty was enough to send a family to their destruction. This was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a systematic dismantling of the social and political fabric of the Tang dynasty. The focus of this terror was primarily on the Li clan, the very family whose dynasty she was upholding. Zetian understood that the greatest threat to her power came not from external enemies, but from within the royal family itself. The crescendo of this terror came in 688, when a group of Li clan princes, seeing the writing on the wall, launched a preemptive rebellion. They knew that their family was being systematically targeted, and they hoped to rally support to stop her purge. Zetian, however, was prepared. She crushed the rebellion with a terrifying ferocity, using it as an excuse to unleash a wider purge. The princes were not just executed. Their family members, friends, and even distant relatives were arrested. The scale of the bloodshed was immense. Dozens of Li clan princes and royal cousins were compelled to commit suicide, a horrifying and public display of her absolute power. The message was unmistakable. There would be no more challenges, no more rebellions. The Li family's dominion was at an end. With all opposition crushed and a terrified court at her command, Zetian prepared for her final audacious act. In 690, she forced her son Ruizong to abdicate in her favor. The act was both unprecedented and shocking, a direct violation of millennia of tradition. A woman on the throne was a complete inversion of the natural order as the Chinese saw it. To legitimize her rule, she proclaimed the establishment of a new dynasty, the Zhou, forging a new imperial surname, Zhao, to replace Li. She declared herself Holy Emperor, and for the first time in Chinese history, a woman sat on the dragon throne, an act of supreme power written in the blood and fear of her enemies. This was not a peaceful transition of power, but the violent, terrifying culmination of a lifelong crusade. The world of the Tang dynasty was dead, and in its place, a new world, a woman's world, had been born. The empire Zetian had so ruthlessly seized began to unravel not from an external assault, but from within her own court. As she entered her final years, her health began to fail, and her iron will, once unyielding, grew frail. Her reign, which had been a symphony of control and terror, began to descend into a chaotic and unstable cacophony. The men who now held her ear were not brilliant strategists or loyal officials, but two handsome young brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong. She had taken them as lovers, and their influence over the aging emperor grew to be immense. They wielded her power with reckless abandon, promoting their own families, ousting rival officials, and making enemies of everyone who saw them for what they were: sycophants who had taken advantage of a weakened ruler. Their arrogance was a fatal flaw in the empire's carefully constructed terror. The same methods Zetian had used to silence dissent were now being misused by two men for personal gain, and the court, having been purged of its most powerful voices, was left to seethe in impotent rage. The Zhang brothers' misuse of power led to a tragic echo of her own past brutality. After her grandson, Li Chongrun, and her granddaughter, Li Xianhui, dared to criticize the Zhangs, they were forced to commit suicide. The echoes of her own son's mysterious deaths years earlier returned with a sickening clarity. The very terror she had created was now consuming her own family, a cruel irony that signaled the end of her reign. The throne of bones, it seemed, was now a trap. The end came not with a grand battle, but with a quiet, decisive palace coup. On the 20th of February, 705, while Zetian lay gravely ill, a group of officials and generals led by Zhang Jianji and supported by her exiled son, Li Xian Zhongzong, stormed the palace. The move was swift, a final, bloody act of rebellion from men who had long waited in the shadows. The Zhang brothers, the source of so much corruption and anger, were killed. Her remaining loyalists and power centers were quickly secured, and her last allies were neutralized. The woman who had built an empire on cunning and foresight was caught completely off guard, her mind now too weak to resist the final, fatal turn of the wheel. The next day, on the 21st of February, the inevitable was made official. The dying emperor was forced to abdicate in favor of her son, Zhongzong. The Zhou dynasty, a testament to her absolute will and the brutality that came with it, was officially over. The Tang dynasty was restored, as if her entire 75-year legacy was nothing more than a terrible interlude, a nightmare from which the empire could finally awaken. She died less than a year later. On the 16th of December, 705, a woman who had once been the most powerful person in the world, now fading into history. Her final act, however, was perhaps her most mysterious and enduring. Over her tomb in the Qianling Mausoleum, a towering, magnificent blank stele was erected. It was a cold, unadorned stone, completely devoid of any inscription or epitaph. It stands as a profound symbol of her unspoken legacy. The men who came after her could not decide what to write. Was she a glorious and powerful emperor who had presided over a period of great prosperity? Or was she a tyrannical monster who had seized power through murder and deception? Was she a visionary who had reshaped the very foundations of the dynasty, or a demon who had brought chaos and terror to the court? The stone, so tall and imposing, offers no answers. It is a monument to a legacy too great, too controversial, and too contradictory to be written down. It forces those who look upon it to confront the unanswerable questions of her life. She was the concubine who became the emperor, the mother who murdered her own children, the reformer who reigned through fear, and the woman who ultimately became a paradox that defied all easy explanations. The blank stele is her final, silent testimony. It stands as a permanent and powerful reminder that the story of Zetian is not one that can ever be fully told, but one that must be grappled with in a perpetual state of wonder and horror. The unwritten story is the one that lasts.